The night was supposed to be a celebration. The marble floors of the Whitmore Grand Hotel reflected 100 dancing candle flames, and the guests, bankers, board members, city councilmen, and their immaculate wives, moved through the room like figures in a painting no ordinary person was meant to touch. It was the annual gala of Callaway and Associates, the most prestigious architectural firm on the Eastern Seaboard, and tonight, its founder was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award. His name was Richard Callaway, and standing near the back of the room, half hidden behind an enormous floral arrangement, was his wife, Eleanor. She wore a deep navy gown, empire-waisted, elegant, chosen specifically to accommodate the unmistakable roundness of her belly. 7 months and 3 weeks along. The baby moved as Eleanor shifted her weight from one heel to the other, and she pressed a quiet hand to her side, the way mothers do, instinctively, privately, as though making a small promise only the two of them understood. She wasn't supposed to be here, technically. Her doctor had suggested rest. Her feet were swollen inside her heels. The drive had taken 40 minutes, and her back had ached the entire way. But Richard had called that afternoon, his voice warm in the way it only was when he needed something, and he'd said, "It would mean everything to me if you were there, Elle. You know how these things look." So she came. She always came. She found him near the podium, laughing with the kind of easy confidence that had made her fall in love with him a decade ago. He looked extraordinary in his tuxedo, broad-shouldered, silver at his temples now, jaw still sharp. She started toward him, her hand raised in a small wave, warmth already rising in her chest. He saw her, and something in his face, something so brief that no one else would have noticed, flickered. Not joy, not relief, not the soft pride husband feels when his pregnant wife crosses a crowded room to reach him. Something else, something cold. He turned, just slightly, and the woman beside him turned too. Tall, red-dressed, dark hair swept over one bare shoulder. She was laughing at something Richard had just said, her hand resting with extraordinary familiarity on his forearm, fingers curved, easy, as though they had rested there 1,000 times before. Eleanor stopped walking. The room continued around her. The jazz played, the candles flickered. Someone clinked a glass nearby and laughed too loudly. Richard said something to the woman in red. The woman glanced toward Eleanor and did not look away. There was no embarrassment in her eyes, no surprise, only something that looked terribly, unmistakably like ownership. And then Richard Callaway did the thing that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. He turned back toward the woman in red. He picked up her champagne flute from the table beside them, and he handed it to her. He did not walk toward his wife. He did not cross the room. He did not acknowledge the woman carrying his child, who was standing 15 feet away in a room full of the people they both knew. He simply turned away. Eleanor stood perfectly still, one hand on her belly. The baby moved again, a slow rolling press against the inside of her ribs, as though the child already sensed something had shifted in the universe tonight. And then Richard leaned down and said something into the red-dressed woman's ear, and she smiled, the intimate, unhurried smile of a woman who has already won. And Eleanor finally understood. She understood all of it. But what she did not yet know, what no one in that glittering room could have imagined, was that a sealed envelope in a law office across the city was about to rewrite everything Richard Callaway believed he owned. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end in that ballroom. It ends in a courtroom, with Richard Callaway sitting very, very still, and Eleanor standing. Back to a small university town in Western Virginia, where the oak trees went gold in October, and the graduate students lived on bad coffee and borrowed library books. Eleanor Marsh before she was Eleanor Callaway, was 24 years old and studying architectural history. She had a small apartment with a radiator that clanked in the night and a collection of art prints taped to the walls with museum putty because she couldn't afford frames yet. She was not the kind of girl people immediately noticed in a room. She was quiet, precise, the kind of woman whose beauty announced herself slowly, in the way she listened, in the thoughtful pause before she spoke, in the particular quality of her attention that made anyone she focused on feel, for the duration of that conversation, like the most interesting person in the world. Richard noticed her at a university symposium. He was a guest speaker, already successful at 32, already the kind of man who wore his confidence like a second skin. Eleanor had asked a question during the Q&A that stopped him mid-sentence, not a flattering question, a challenging one. She had pointed, quietly and precisely, to a structural oversight in the design philosophy he'd been championing for 15 minutes. He had stared at her, and then he had smiled, a real smile, surprised and genuinely delighted, and said, "That is an excellent point. Would you like to discuss it over coffee?" They talked for 3 hours that evening, then 4 hours the following Saturday, then every day for the next 2 weeks in coffee shops and on long walks through the gold-leafed campus, until it became impossible to pretend it was anything other than what it was. He told her she was the smartest person he'd ever met. She believed him because he said it as though the observation unsettled him slightly, which felt more honest than a compliment delivered smoothly. She moved to the city for him a year later, left the graduate program she'd been accepted into, a prestigious fellowship in Florence, the one she had applied to 3 times because he said he couldn't do the distance. She told herself it was a postponement. She would go back. She would finish. She did not go back. Instead, she poured herself into him, into his firm, his vision, his relentless ambition. In those early years when Callaway and Associates was still a mid-sized company scraping for commissions, it was Eleanor who sat at the kitchen table with him at midnight, going over proposal documents and project bids. It was Eleanor who redesigned their entire client presentation format, reworking the visual language, the narrative framing, after their 3rd major pitch failed. The 4th pitch won. The contract that followed tripled the firm's profile. Richard took the call in the kitchen, whooping, lifting Eleanor off her feet and spinning her while she laughed. And he said, "We did it, Elle. We actually did it." We. She remembered that word for a long time. They married in a small ceremony, her preference, not his, but he indulged her. Her father walked her down an aisle of white roses in afternoon light, and Richard had looked at her with what she was certain was complete, unguarded love, and said the vows in a voice so steady and quiet that several guests later told her it was the most moving ceremony they had ever attended. For the first several years, it was good, genuinely, substantially good. But ambition, Eleanor would eventually learn, is a climate. It changes the landscape around it so gradually that you don't notice the temperature dropping until you're already cold. The midnight kitchen sessions became his late nights at the office. The we became I, not in small dramatic announcements, but in the accumulating weight of 100 unremarkable moments. The award acceptance speeches that mentioned partners and colleagues and never her. The dinner parties where he spoke about his vision and she refilled glasses and smiled. The business decisions she'd quietly shaped that reached the world wearing only his name. She told herself this was love, that supporting a partner meant making room for them to grow, even if the room it required was the space you'd been standing in. And she had been genuinely happy, not the bright, effortless happiness of early love, but something she believed was more durable, a settled, rooted kind of contentment. They had built something real. She had built something, even if the world saw only his fingerprints on it. Then, 18 months ago, she became pregnant. It was not planned, but it was not unwelcome. Eleanor was 35. She had begun to quietly wonder in the way women who want children and never quite make the time eventually do. When she looked at the test, alone in the marble bathroom of the house Richard had chosen and she had furnished, she sat on the edge of the tub for a long time. Then she smiled, slowly, to herself, like a door opening somewhere inside her. She told Richard over dinner. His reaction was a beat too long, a degree too careful. Wow, okay, that's big. He had reached across the table and covered her hand, and she had read warmth into the gesture because she needed to. He had grown more distant since then. She noticed. She filed it under stress. The firm had been expanding. A major international contract had been complicated. There were restructuring pressures. She gave him space because she thought that was what love required. She had not followed him when he stayed late. She had not read his phone. She was not, she had always believed, the suspicious kind. She had trusted him. And trust, as it turns out, is the precise vulnerability that certain people know how to stand on while they burn the floor beneath you. Eleanor learned this not from Richard, but from a woman she barely knew, Marcus Webb's wife, Diane, who had called Eleanor on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the gala, her voice carrying the particular uncomfortable energy of someone delivering information they are relieved to be rid of. Diane had been careful, circling. Eleanor had let her circle, waiting, already knowing from the quality of Diane's careful circling that whatever was coming would not be small. I've seen them together, Elle, more than once. The firm's new interior consultant. She's been brought in on the Hargrove project. I didn't want to, I could be wrong about what I saw, but I couldn't not say anything. Eleanor thanked her, calmly, with the eerie, floating composure that sometimes descends when a thing you half known for months is finally said aloud. She spent 2 days not doing anything at all. She went to her prenatal appointments, she arranged the nursery, she cooked dinner and set the table, and sat across from Richard and watched his face with new eyes, not suspicious eyes, but archaeological ones, looking for strata, for the layers of what had always been there, now that she knew where to look. The distance, the phone placed face down, the business trip in October that she had never questioned, the particular texture of his absence that she had been calling stress, which was a different shape when she examined it honestly. She didn't confront him immediately. People always want to know why she waited, and the answer is both simple and impossible to explain to anyone who's loved someone for a decade. She was waiting to be wrong. She was still, some part of her, hoping to be wrong. She was not wrong. The morning of the gala, while Richard showered, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Eleanor was close. She saw the name, Vanessa, and the preview of the message before the screen dimmed. Tonight, I'll wear the red. Don't make me wait too long. Eleanor set the phone back down, face down, exactly as she'd found it. She went to the closet and chose the navy gown. She did her hair. She painted her lips a soft rose. She looked at herself in the mirror, the fullness of her belly, the steadiness of her own eyes, and she breathed. She went to the gala. Not because she hadn't understood the message, she had understood it perfectly. She went because she needed to see it. She needed to see his face when he saw her, to take the last hope she was holding and either confirm it or release it. She needed the truth to be undeniable, not inferred, not the story of a woman who imagined things and overreacted, but the simple, witnessed reality of what her marriage had become. She got that truth, standing 15 feet away, watching her husband hand a glass of champagne to a woman in a red dress. And then she did something no one in that ballroom expected. She turned around. She walked, steadily, unhurried, with the full gravity of a woman who is 7 months pregnant and has just made a decision. Back through the crowd, through the lobby, and out through the tall glass doors into the October night. She did not cry, not yet. The valet brought her car. She sat behind the wheel and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and she stared at the gleaming entrance of the Whitmore Grand Hotel. And she thought, I need a lawyer. That was her first clear thought. Not grief, not rage, practicality. The fierce, focused practicality of a woman who has just realized she is the only person in the world who will protect her child. But she did not know, she could not have known, that something else was already in motion. Something set in place long before Richard ever met Vanessa Cole, long before Eleanor had ever moved to this city, left her fellowship, given her quiet years to a man who had spent the last one giving himself to someone else. Something her grandfather had put in place the year Eleanor turned 21, in a conversation they'd had over tea on his back porch in late summer. A conversation she had largely forgotten, a piece of paper she had signed without reading closely, because her grandfather had said, "You'll understand this one day, Eleanor. Maybe not for a long time, but you'll understand it." She was about to understand it. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday, not by conversation, not with the dignity of a husband sitting across from his wife of 9 years and speaking to her like a person. They arrived by courier in a large manila envelope while Eleanor was eating breakfast. The courier was young and uncomfortable and would not meet her eyes. She signed for them. She set them on the kitchen table. She finished her eggs. Then she picked them up and read them, slowly and carefully, the way she had always read everything important. The grounds cited were irreconcilable. The proposed settlement was, she turned the pages, following the figures with her finger, deeply, deliberately inadequate. A lump sum, a modest monthly support figure. The house she had found, furnished and transformed from a contractor's showpiece into a home, offered for buyout at a value she immediately recognized as below current appraisal. She set the papers down. She thought about the kitchen table they were sitting on. She had found it at an estate sale, a beautiful old farm table with a worn top and legs she had had refinished. She thought about the bookcases in the study, built to her specifications. She thought about the nursery down the hall, the soft yellow she had painted it herself over 2 weekends, her belly making the ceiling hard to reach, and the white crib she'd assembled alone on a Saturday afternoon while Richard was at the office, following the instructions methodically, making sure every bolt was tight. She picked up her phone and called her doctor first. She had been monitoring a slight elevation in her blood pressure for the past 2 weeks, and she was not going to let devastation override her obligation to the child she was carrying. "Come in Friday," her doctor said. "We'll check everything. And Eleanor, stress management is non-negotiable right now. I mean that." "I understand," Eleanor said. She called her lawyer second. Meredith Park had been a family referral, a woman in her early 50s, quiet and formidable, who had once described her practice philosophy as surgical precision, no theatrics. She respected her immediately. She made an appointment on Monday. On Friday, the checkup showed her blood pressure slightly elevated, but within manageable range. The baby was healthy, head down, strong heartbeat, moving well. The ultrasound technician turned the screen toward Eleanor and pointed out the profile of her daughter's face, the curve of her nose, the line of her lips. Eleanor looked at that small, grainy, perfect face for a long time. "Is everything okay?" the ultrasound technician asked, because Eleanor had gone very still. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm just memorizing her." That night, it rained. She sat in the living room with the lights low, one hand on her belly, listening to the rain against the windows. The house was very quiet. She had asked Richard to stay elsewhere. He apparently had been more than prepared to do so, and the silence had a texture to it that was both unbearable and, she was beginning to suspect, necessary, like a wound that needs air to heal. She thought about the woman she had been at 24, asking challenging questions at a university symposium. She thought about the fellowship in Florence. She thought about the papers on the kitchen table and the figure they had put on 9 years of her life. She pressed her palm to the side of her belly and felt her daughter move, a slow, deliberate push, as though reaching back. "I know," Eleanor said aloud to the quiet room. "I know." She didn't say the rest, didn't need to. The rest was between herself and the child she was carrying, and the particular silence of a woman who has finished grieving and is beginning to think.
She slept better that night than she had in months, because there is a kind of peace that comes not from having answers, but from having finally stopped pretending you don't know the questions. And somewhere across the city, in a law office where the rain was also falling, a file with Eleanor's name on it was sitting in a cabinet, had been sitting there for 14 years, waiting. But what Richard Calloway didn't know would change everything. Most people in the city's older financial circles had heard of Harold Marsh, though the name had faded in the years since his death, the way certain kinds of quiet, long-term power tends to fade, leaving its effects present long after the name is gone. He had built his fortune slowly, over 50 years in commercial real estate and investment holdings, not with the flashy, newspaper-covered velocity of men like Richard Calloway, but with the patient, compounding certainty of a man who understood that the most durable kind of wealth is the kind that doesn't announce itself. Harold Marsh had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He had watched each of them carefully, the way men of his generation and discipline watched everything, without comment, over time, looking not for the impressive moments, but for the reliable ones. He was looking for the one who would be steady, the one who would not be dazzled by proximity to power, because they would understand at some essential level what power actually was. He decided it was Eleanor when she was 19. She had come to him during a family financial crisis. Her parents' restaurant had hit serious difficulty, and there was a question of whether the family home might need to be sold. She had sat across from Harold at his kitchen table and laid out with a yellow legal pad and a pencil a restructuring plan, not an emotional appeal, a plan, cash flow projections, debt prioritization, a 3-year recovery pathway. She had done it alone without being asked because someone needed to. Harold had looked at the yellow legal pad for a long time. Then he had looked at Eleanor, and he had said, "Good, now let me show you what you missed." That began 5 years of what Eleanor privately thought of as her real education. Saturday afternoons at Harold's house, his library full of annual reports and legal documents, and the kind of financial texts that are not taught in universities because they are too blunt about how the world actually works. He taught her to read a balance sheet the way a doctor reads an X-ray. He taught her the difference between wealth that is visible and wealth that is structural. He told her repeatedly in various formulations, the money that makes noise is not always the money that matters. When she turned 21, he called her to his back porch on a summer afternoon, and they drank tea and looked at the garden, and he told her about the trust. He had established it years earlier, adding to it steadily over time, with the specific intention of transferring it at the right moment to the right person. Over decades, it had grown quietly. It held investment portfolios, 2 commercial real estate properties in the city's financial district, and, the piece Eleanor had not fully absorbed at the time, a 31% equity stake in a mid-size architectural and development firm that Harold had invested in during its founding period. The firm's name at the time of his investment had been Webb and Calloway Design Group. It had since been renamed. It was now called Calloway and Associates. Eleanor was 21 when she signed the trust documentation. She had understood its general contours, but not, as Harold had likely known she would not yet understand, its full significance. She had stored the information in the back of her mind the way you store information that doesn't yet have a context to live in. She had then, years later, married Richard Calloway, and because she was not a suspicious woman, because she had trusted her husband, because the trust was structured as a blind holding, her ownership not publicly disclosed, not reflected in any documents Richard had ever seen, she had never mentioned it. In fact, she had largely not thought about it. She had her own small income from consulting work she did quietly, her own savings account, her own sense of private financial independence that she had maintained without fanfare because Harold had told her, never let your security depend entirely on another person's goodwill. She had listened to that. She just hadn't understood until the divorce papers arrived on her kitchen table how completely she had listened. Meredith Park found out about the trust on a Monday morning. Eleanor brought Harold's original documentation, the trust account statements she'd located in a filing cabinet in her home office, never touched, accumulating quietly over the years, and laid them on Meredith's desk. Meredith put on her reading glasses. She read in silence for a long time. Then she looked up. "Eleanor," she said, with the carefully measured tone of someone who is working hard not to let her expression change too much. "Do you understand what this says?" "I think so. I'd like to hear you say it." "This trust gives you beneficial ownership of 31% of Calloway & Associates. It has been accruing in value since before your marriage." Meredith set the papers down. "It also means that Richard's attempt to classify the firm as his sole personal asset in these divorce proceedings is, to use the technical term, a significant problem for him." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "How significant?" she asked. "The kind that changes the entire character of a case." Eleanor nodded slowly, the way she had nodded at her grandfather's kitchen table years ago when a piece of information settled into place. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said. She reached into the folder and produced a second document. "My grandfather passed away 6 weeks ago. I was his executor. The will is in probate. There's a formal reading scheduled. The estate solicitor's office, his attorney, family members. It's in 2 weeks." She placed the document on the desk. "You think you should be there," she said. Meredith looked at her for a long moment. "I think," Meredith said carefully, "you may want to let Richard's legal team know about the reading." "Oh, I will," Eleanor said. The office of Hawthorne, Greer and Associates occupied the top floor of a sandstone building in the oldest part of the financial district. It was the kind of firm whose reputation was so old it had become ambient, simply part of the city's architecture, like the courthouses and the libraries and the bronze statues in the public square. The will reading of Harold Marsh was scheduled for a Tuesday at 11 in the morning. The room was paneled in dark wood and lined with bookshelves. A long table ran its center. The autumn light came through tall windows in clean, pale columns. The smell was of paper and old leather and the particular calm of a space where serious things are decided with measured voices. Eleanor arrived at 10:50. She wore charcoal gray, a tailored wrap dress that accommodated her belly without apology, her hair pulled back simply, pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had prepared for this, who had slept the night before, who was not afraid. Meredith Park sat to her left, a slim leather portfolio open on the table before her. To Eleanor's right sat her Aunt Patricia, Harold's daughter, who had been told this was a routine probate reading and who was watching Eleanor with confused, slightly worried eyes. Across the table sat Richard's attorney, a silver-haired man named Forsyth, who had the smooth, permanently composed expression of a man who had sat in many rooms like this and was never surprised. Richard had not been required to attend a will reading, of course, but Forsyth was there because Meredith had sent the relevant disclosure notices, and Forsyth had seen enough of the preliminary documentation to know he needed to be present. He had not told Richard precisely why. He had said it was procedural. Richard arrived at 11:05. He wore a dark suit. He looked like a man who owns things. the unconscious physical grammar of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given space. He surveyed the room as he entered, and when his eyes found Eleanor, something crossed his face: surprise, recalculation, and beneath those, very briefly, the specific discomfort of a man who has underestimated a situation. He sat. He did not look at her again. The estate solicitor, a careful, deliberate woman named Mrs. Chen, who had been with Hawthorne Greer for 30 years, settled her papers and began. The early portions of the will were straightforward: Harold's personal effects, distributed among family, smaller financial gifts to grandchildren, a bequest to a university scholarship fund he'd established quietly, years before, for first-generation students from low-income backgrounds. The room was quiet and respectful, as rooms during will readings tend to be, a specific quality of attention, half reverence and half calculation. Then Mrs. Chen reached the section that had been filed under sealed addendum. She paused. She looked up over her reading glasses with the calm authority of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what is coming. The following section of Mr. Marsh's will contains provisions established 14 years ago with a final codicil added 8 months ago, 6 weeks prior to Mr. Marsh's death, updating certain designations. I will read it in full. The room was very quiet. Forsyth's pen had stopped moving. I, Harold James Marsh, being of sound mind, do hereby make the following declarations regarding the Marsh Family Trust, established 19 years ago for the primary benefit of my granddaughter, Eleanor Ann Marsh. Mrs. Chen read steadily, precisely, in the clear, unhurried language of legal documentation that has been crafted carefully enough to be its own kind of music. She read the structure of the trust, the compounded value of its investment holdings over 14 years, a figure that when stated aloud in that quiet wood-paneled room caused Richard's attorney to uncap his pen again and write a number on his legal pad, a large number, the kind that changes the arithmetic of every argument you came into the room intending to make. She read the real estate holdings, 2 properties in the financial district, held in the trust, unencumbered by any marital asset claim because the trust predated the marriage by 7 years and had been structured specifically for individual rather than joint ownership. She read the equity stake, 31%, Callaway and Associates. She read the current appraised value of that stake, as assessed by an independent financial firm 8 months ago, the same week the final codicil had been added to the will. Richard's attorney had stopped writing. He was very still. Richard himself had not moved in several minutes. Mrs. Chen turned to the codicil. The following represents Mr. Marsh's final addendum, signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary, dated 8 months prior to Mr. Marsh's death. She paused. In a room that was already silent, the silence deepened by a register. I am adding this codicil because I have become aware of circumstances in my granddaughter's marriage that concern me. I am adding it not out of bitterness or judgment, but because I was a builder, and builders understand foundations. A structure built on an unstable foundation will fail, regardless of how impressive it appears. I have watched Eleanor give quietly for many years. I have watched her support a man who, I believe, does not fully understand what he has been given. I do not say this to condemn. I say this because I want Eleanor, and any children she may have, to know that the foundation beneath her was never his to stand on. It was always hers. The room breathed. Mrs. Chen continued. I am therefore adding the following clarification to the trust documentation. In the event of any legal proceedings related to Eleanor's marriage,
including but not limited to divorce proceedings. This trust, its full holdings, and its beneficial ownership shall be made formally and publicly a matter of record via this will in a proceeding where all relevant parties are present. I am doing this because I know Eleanor. She is not a woman who announces herself. She may need to be announced." In the silence that followed, Eleanor heard the rain beginning outside the tall windows, a soft, steady sound. She was looking at her hands, folded on the table, quiet, still. "She was always the finest thing I built," Mrs. Chen finished the codicil in the careful, uninflected voice of a professional who is very much a professional. "I leave it everything to Eleanor. Use it well, Eleanor. You know how." The room remained still for a long moment. Then Forsyth cleared his throat, the specific throat clearing of a man recalibrating an entire legal strategy in real time. He looked at his legal pad. He looked at Meredith Park, who was regarding him with the precise, composed attention of someone who has set a table very carefully and now was watching someone sit down at it. Richard turned his head slowly and looked at Eleanor. She turned and looked back at him. She was not triumphant. That was the thing that people who were in the room that day would later remark upon when they described it to others. She did not look like a woman who had won. She looked like a woman who had always known something and was simply, finally, in a room where it had been said aloud. Her expression was calm, clear, the way a person looks when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have finally set it down, not with relief exactly, but with the particular quiet of a completed act. "Richard," Meredith Park said in the direction of Forsyth, rather than Richard himself, lawyer to lawyer, the language of people who are about to have a very different conversation than the one they arrived expecting. "I think we should schedule a meeting to discuss the revised parameters of the settlement." Forsyth nodded once, without speaking, the nod of a man who has understood the dimensions of the situation. Richard said nothing. He sat in a room full of dark wood and winter light, and the echo of his wife's grandfather's voice, and he said nothing at all, because there was nothing, legally, financially, or morally, left to say. Eleanor turned her attention back to Mrs. Chen. "I believe there are a few remaining bequests," she said. "Yes," Mrs. Chen said, adjusting her papers. "Shall we continue?" "Please," said Eleanor. In the end, the terms were different in every material way from what had arrived in that manila envelope on a Thursday morning. The house was hers at full market value. The support structure was comprehensive and long-term. Richard's attorneys, operating now from a position of considerably diminished leverage, were efficient and professional, and not particularly warm. She did not ask for the firm. That surprised people who heard the story later. Friends, her Aunt Patricia, even Meredith, who had given her a long, level look over their final review meeting and said, "You could, 31% in a closely held company, in the right circumstances with the right motions, you could force a very uncomfortable conversation." "I know," Eleanor said, "but you won't." "No." "Why?" Eleanor considered this for a moment. She was 8 months pregnant now. The baby moved against her ribs with increasing confidence, as though impatient with the entire situation and ready to begin her own story. "Because I don't want his company," Eleanor said. "I want my life. Those aren't the same thing." Meredith had looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but somewhere in the middle, something that might have been respect. "All right," she said. The trust, Eleanor decided, would fund the architectural fellowship she had deferred 14 years ago. Not for herself. That particular door had closed, and she had made her peace with it, in the way you make peace with things that were once possible and are simply no longer the point.
But for others, there was a program she'd identified at a university that worked with students from low-income backgrounds, students who wanted to study architecture and design and the kind of structural, patient thinking her grandfather had taught her. Students who had the ability, but not the foundation. She thought Harold would have liked that. She also, quietly, put the trust's existing holdings under professional management and began educating herself on its structure with the same focused, methodical attention she had once given to Richard's firm at midnight at a kitchen table. She understood that wealth she had never asked for now required her stewardship. She was not dazzled by it. She was practical about it. This, she suspected, was exactly why Harold had chosen her. Her daughter was born on a Tuesday in late November. She was 7 pounds 4 ounces, with her mother's eyes and a remarkable expression of focused appraisal that caused the delivery nurse to laugh and say she looked like she was assessing the room. Eleanor held her in the yellow-painted room with the white crib that her mother had assembled alone, and the world outside was very quiet, and the baby looked up at Eleanor with that extraordinary ancient gaze that newborns have, the look of someone who has just arrived from somewhere large and uncharted and is taking careful first stock of where they've landed. "Hi," Eleanor said. The baby blinked, slowly, with enormous composure. "I know," Eleanor said. "I know." She named her Frances Harold Calloway. Frances for no one in particular. She simply liked the weight of it, the old-fashioned solidity. Harold for a man who understood her before she understood herself, and who spent the last years of his life making sure she would be all right. She was all right. She was better than all right, though it took time. The honest, unglamorous, non-cinematic kind of time. The kind that doesn't make for dramatic scenes, before she fully understood that. There were mornings that were hard. There was a grief, separate from the grief of betrayal, that simply was the grief of a marriage ending, the loss of a shared life, even an imperfect one, even one that had been built on a misunderstanding of who was doing most of the building. That grief was real, and she let herself feel it, in the way her grandfather had taught her to look at losses, squarely, for the exact amount of time they warranted, and then forward. She did not see Richard often. When she did, at the necessary appointments, the legal formalities, the first carefully orchestrated visit when Frances was 3 months old, he was polite and somewhat diminished, in the way that powerful men can become somewhat diminished once the architecture of what held them up has been made visible. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she could not entirely read. Not remorse exactly, perhaps something more uncomfortable, a recognition. She did not require his recognition. She had discovered, stopped requiring things from him somewhat before the legal proceedings were complete. The moment in the will reading room was significant, yes, but the real shift, the one that mattered, had happened in her living room on a rainy Friday night with her hand on her belly and the lights low and the house very quiet. That was when she had stopped waiting, when she had understood that she was not a woman waiting for rescue or vindication or acknowledgement. She was a woman who knew how to read a balance sheet and build a nursery alone and recognize in the grainy image on an ultrasound screen the face of the person she was most responsible to. That was the moment Eleanor Calloway became fully and irreversibly herself. On the Saturday after Frances turned 1 year old, Eleanor took her to the botanical garden at the edge of the city. It was a late autumn morning, clear and cold, the kind of day where the light comes in flat and golden and makes everything look like the last scene of something very long. Frances, steady on her feet now, though only barely, tottering with the focused intensity of someone who has somewhere important to be, pulled away from Eleanor's hand and made for a low stone bench near the rose beds. She put both palms on the bench's surface and looked at them thoughtfully, as though the bench were a document she was reading. Eleanor watched her. She had her hands in the pockets of her coat and her face in the thin autumn sun, and she was thinking, not about Richard, not about the settlement, not about the meetings or the documents, or the year of slow, methodical reconstruction she had been living through. She was thinking about a conversation she had had with Harold on a summer porch a long time ago, about a man who taught her over 5 years of Saturday afternoons that the most important question you can ask about a structure is not how impressive it looks, but what it is built on. She looked at her daughter. Frances had now moved from the bench to a patch of frozen grass, which she was testing with one foot, with the expression of a person performing a structural integrity assessment. "I see you," Eleanor said. Frances looked up and smiled, the full, open, uncomplicated smile of a 1-year-old who has been seen by the person she most wanted to see her. And Eleanor felt something move in her chest that was not grief and not triumph and not relief, but something that didn't have a simpler name than this: the specific rightness of being exactly where you are supposed to be. Eleanor crossed the grass. She picked her daughter up. Frances settled against her shoulder with the comfortable authority of someone who has always trusted where they would land. The garden was very still. The light was very gold. And Eleanor Marsh returned to herself, the name she'd been born into and was reclaiming, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone finishing a sentence, stood in the autumn morning with her daughter and breathed. And here is the thing about women like Eleanor. The world rarely sees them coming. They are not loud. They do not threaten. They do not perform their strength or announce their grievances or demand to be noticed. They simply, over years and decades, through loss and sacrifice and the slow, patient accumulation of understanding, they simply build. And when the people who took them for granted finally look up, they find that the ground has shifted, that the floor they were standing on was not theirs to stand on, that what they mistook for deference was in fact strategy, and what they dismissed as quietness was in fact preparation, and what they called weakness was the most powerful thing in any room: a woman who knows exactly who she is. Richard Calloway built a company. Eleanor Marsh built a foundation. They are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. If Eleanor's story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been the quiet one in a room, building something no one else could see yet, this one was for you.